Welcome to another video on stories of our history. At dawn on Friday the 13th of October in the year 1307, the royal agents of King Philip the Fair swept across every bailey and preceptory of the Knights Templar in France, arresting Grand Master Jacques de Molay and hundreds of knights in a single coordinated strike that would echo through the centuries and birth 1,000 legends. The charge was heresy, but the real motivation lay in the staggering mountain of debt that Philip owed to the order, a financial empire that had grown from humble protectors of pilgrims into the most sophisticated banking network of medieval Europe, holding vast deposits of gold, silver, land, and entire fleets. As the trials dragged on under torture and the Pope was forced to dissolve the order in 1312, the great question burned in every royal court: where did the treasure go? The papal decree ordered all assets transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, yet in France the crown extracted astronomical fees for judicial processing that gutted the liquid wealth, leaving stone castles and empty coffers. What followed was not a single fate but a fractured, continent-wide chess game, and nowhere was the gamble more audacious than in a small kingdom on the edge of the known world, where a king of poets and builders decided that the temple would not die but be reborn under a new name. The central character of this survival is Dom Dinis of Portugal, the sixth king of the Burgundian dynasty, who ruled from 1279 to 1325 and earned the title, the Farmer King, for his relentless modernization of agriculture, but whose greatest crop was political genius. While papal legates demanded the arrest of Templars and the seizure of their goods, Dinis studied the canonical fine print, buying time with diplomatic letters and careful delays that stretched from 1309 all the way to the pivotal year 1319. He understood something that Philip IV did not: the true value of the temple lay not in chests of coin that could be spent in a single war, but in the living network of fortified commanderies, experienced fighting men and maritime knowledge that could guard a kingdom and fuel expansion for generations. Today's journey traces that astonishing legal alchemy, the birth of the Order of Christ, and the direct thread that connects a persecuted medieval brotherhood to the caravels that reached Brazil, India and Japan, turning Portugal into the first global empire. By the end of the 13th century the Templars had become a state within a state, operating 870 castles and preceptories spread from Scotland to Jerusalem, their treasure houses serving popes and kings with letters of credit that made long-distance trade possible without carrying dangerous bullion. In Paris alone the temple fortress served as the royal treasury, a massive dungeon where the crown's own gold sat under Templar guard, an irony that Philip IV exploited ruthlessly when he moved his own administration into the building after the arrests. The staggering scale of the wealth can be glimpsed in the inventories demanded by the inquisitors: dozens of chests of silver marks, golden reliquaries studded with gems, silk vestments, armor and weapons, and above all the records of debts owed by nobles and monarchs across Christendom. Yet when investigators reached the underground vaults of the Paris Temple, the fabled treasure of legend, the bullion reserves, seemed to have evaporated, a mystery that gave rise to tales of a secret fleet sailing under cover of night toward La Rochelle, loaded with gold and the Order's most sacred relics. While the galleys of legend still fascinate treasure hunters, the historical trail leads to a far more complex dispersal, and the papal bull ad Providam of May 2, 1312 tried to impose order by giving all Templar possessions to the Hospitallers, except those in the kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, Portugal and Majorca, which were to be held in papal reservation pending a special decision. In practice, every monarch acted according to self-interest, and Philip of France saw an opportunity to present an enormous bill for the trials, interrogations, prison maintenance and guard salaries that absorbed every livre and denier of the liquid assets that could be found in the French treasury of the temple. Historian Malcolm Barber notes that the French crown extracted so much in fees that the Hospitallers ended up with heavily encumbered properties and massive debts to the same royal treasury that was supposed to transfer them, a Pyrrhic inheritance that demonstrated the crown's true aim all along. In contrast, the Iberian kingdoms viewed the Templars not as a domestic threat, but as a vital frontier shield against the Muslim states of Granada and North Africa, creating a political landscape where dissolution was negotiated rather than enforced with the rack and the stake. The first stop in our European tour is the Kingdom of England, where Edward II, son-in-law of Philip the Fair, received the papal orders with visible reluctance and a profound political awkwardness, for he had no quarrel with the Templars and many of his barons respected the order. Arrests began in January 1308, but unlike the mass incarcerations in France, English inquisitors found almost no evidence of heresy and resorted to mild ecclesiastical penances, confining many knights to comfortable monastic custody in houses like the Augustinian Priory of Newark or the Cistercian Abbey of Biddlesden. The bulk of the Templar manors, from the New Temple in London to the agricultural estates of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, were slowly transferred to the Hospitallers over a decade, though the Crown and local lords often managed to skim off rents and revenues during the interregnum. The English chapter thus became one of absorption, not annihilation, a pattern of grudging compliance that kept the social fabric intact while erasing the Templar identity from public life. North of the border, the Kingdom of Scotland under Robert the Bruce offered an even more radical departure, because Bruce himself had been excommunicated for the murder of John Comyn in a church and had no incentive to enforce papal bulls that already condemned him as an outlaw sovereign. Persistent legend holds that a contingent of fugitive Templars fought alongside Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, turning the tide against the English with a surprise cavalry charge, though academic consensus treats this as a romantic embellishment with no contemporary chronicle to support it. What is documented is that many Scottish Templar properties, such as the Preceptory of Ballantradock, simply passed into the hands of local families like the St. Clairs of Rosslyn, who would later build the chapel laden with esoteric carvings that fuel modern myths of Templar continuity. Scotland thus became a haven of quiet disappearance, where knights melted into the clan system or joined the Hospitallers without the dramatic confrontation seen elsewhere, a footnote that nonetheless fed the legend of a secret survival across the northern mists. Yet the only kingdom that elevated the survival from footnote to national destiny was Portugal, a narrow strip of land facing the vast Atlantic, where the Templars had been planted since 1128 as the military spearhead of the Reconquista, building a chain of impregnable castles along the Tagus River and the frontier with the Moors. By the time of the arrests, the order held iconic strongholds like Tomar, Almiral, Monsanto, Pombal and Castelo Branco, controlling the central corridor of the kingdom and serving as the backbone of its defense and territorial consolidation. King Dinis looked at this map and saw not a liability to be liquidated, but a strategic inheritance to be preserved at all costs, and his first move was to order a complete inventory of all Templar assets and to instruct his ambassadors at the papal court in Avignon to plead that the Portuguese Templars were innocent, loyal and indispensable for the security of Christendom's southwestern flank. The stage was set for a decade-long negotiation that would produce one of the most elegant juridical masterpieces of the Middle Ages. To understand the political tightrope that Dom Dinis walked, we must first grasp the peculiar position of the papacy during the Templar affair, because Pope Clement V was a Frenchman, born Bertrand de Got in Gascony, and he owed his tiara to the machinations of Philip the Fair, who had engineered his election in 1305 on the explicit condition that the new pontiff would support the destruction of the temple. Clement V spent the first years of his papacy in a state of constant tension, trying to balance the brutal demands of the French king with the moral authority of the Holy See, and the Council of Vienne, which opened in October 1311, became the arena where the fate of the order would be decided under the shadow of Philip's army waiting just outside the city gates. The king demanded a definitive condemnation without trial, but the council fathers, many of them bishops from Iberia and England, resisted, insisting that the Templars deserved a proper defense and that the order could not be erased without proof of guilt that met canonical standards. In a fateful compromise, Clement issued the bull Vox in Excelso on March 22, 1312, which suppressed the order by apostolic ordinance, not by judicial sentence, a delicate formulation that allowed the Pope to dissolve the temple without declaring it heretical, a critical distinction that Dom Dinis would exploit with surgical precision. With the order dissolved but not declared heretical, the subsequent bull ad Providam of May 2, 1312 awarded the Templar properties to the Hospitallers, excepting the 4 Iberian kingdoms, where a special commission would determine the allocation based on local conditions and the need to defend the frontier against the Muslims. This exception was a diplomatic victory for the peninsular monarchs, who had argued forcefully that confiscating Templar castles in Aragon, Castile, Portugal and Majorca would open a fatal gap in the Christian line just as the Kingdom of Granada remained a belligerent threat and the Marinid dynasty of Morocco still dreamed of a new invasion across the Strait of Gibraltar. In Portugal the argument carried extra weight because the Templar network dominated the central region from the Mondego River to the Tagus, a territory that had only been fully secured a few decades earlier and still required a standing force of armed monks to protect settlers from raid and revolt. Dinis and his chancery composed a series of memorials to Avignon, emphasizing that the Portuguese Templars had never been accused of any crime, that they had been examined by the Bishop of Lisbon and found blameless, and that handing their fortresses to the Hospitallers, who already had their own commanderies and rival interests, would cause administrative chaos and military weakness at a time when the kingdom faced Castilian pressure on the eastern border. The king's ambassadors, led by the shrewd jurist João Martins de Solís, who would later become Archbishop of Braga, spent years in Avignon lobbying cardinals and drafting petitions that slowly shifted the papal position from passive acceptance of the French model to active collaboration with the Portuguese project. They brought with them detailed dossiers on each Templar property, proving that the order in Portugal had always been obedient to the crown, had never formed a separate jurisdiction, and had contributed generously to the royal treasury in times of war, making the point that the king's interest was not to despoil but to protect and reform. In 1314, while Jacques de Molay was being burned on the Isle de la Cite in Paris, Dinis issued a royal decree that sequestered all Templar goods under crown protection, explicitly forbidding any private seizure and ordering his officials to maintain the estates in perfect working order until the Holy See decided their final disposition. This act transformed the king from a passive recipient of papal commands into the active guardian of the Templar patrimony, a position that gave him the leverage to negotiate the terms of the transfer as a sovereign equal rather than a supplicant. While the diplomacy dragged on, Dom Dinis occupied himself with a parallel project that reveals the depth of his strategic thinking: the construction and consolidation of a new royal navy and the encouragement of maritime commerce, signing trade treaties with England in 1308 and Flanders in 1310, and planting the famous pine forest of Leiria to provide timber for shipbuilding. These initiatives were not separate from the Templar question but part of the same grand design, because the king knew that whatever order inherited the Templar estates would need a new mission to justify its existence, and the Atlantic horizon offered a theater of operations far more promising than the exhausted crusades of the Holy Land. The Templars themselves had already accumulated maritime experience, operating a fleet based in the Algarve and the port of Setúbal that transported pilgrims, traded with North Africa and explored the Canary Islands, knowledge that Dinis was determined to keep inside the kingdom. When the royal chancery finally presented its draft proposal to Pope John XXI, the successor of Clement V, the document was not a plea but a blueprint for a new order that would be both national and papal, loyal to the crown but consecrated by the Church, a hybrid creation that anticipated the early modern state. The decisive negotiation took place between 1317 and 1319, when John XXI, a former chancellor of the Kingdom of Naples and a jurist of great subtlety, proved far more sympathetic to the Portuguese arguments than his predecessor had been. Dinis sent him a personal letter, full of the lyrical humility of a poet-king who signed himself as the vassal of St. Peter. But underneath the flowery rhetoric lay an iron political calculus. If the Pope did not approve a Portuguese solution, the Crown would simply keep the assets in sequestration forever, and the Holy See would gain nothing. The king offered a compromise that protected papal authority while serving Portuguese interests, proposing that all Templar goods in Portugal be granted to a new military order, to be called the Order of Christ, which would be under the Cistercian rule, wear a distinctive habit with a cross of Christ, and place its headquarters in the former Templar castle of Castro Marim on the Algarve coast before eventually settling definitively in Tomar. The papal bull Ad Ex Cabus, issued on March 14, 1319 in Avignon, accepted this proposal in its entirety, canonically erecting the Order of Christ and granting it all the movable and immovable property that had belonged to the temple in Portugal, a transfer that was as clean and complete as any medieval charter ever achieved. The bull's text is a masterpiece of legal engineering that deserves close attention, for it begins by praising the king's devotion, then recites the history of the Templar dissolution, noting pointedly that the Portuguese brothers had been found innocent by diligent inquiry, before declaring that the new order would defend the faith, fight the enemies of the cross and be subject to visitation and correction by the abbot of the Cistercian monastery of Alcobaça. This last provision was a stroke of brilliance, because Alcobaça was the richest abbey in Portugal, entirely under royal influence, and making the Order of Christ spiritually dependent on a Portuguese abbot rather than a foreign superior effectively guaranteed its subordination to the crown's political direction. The original seat in Castro Marim, a remote and malaria-ridden corner of the Algarve, was chosen to emphasize the order's new frontier mission against the Muslim world, but it also served to distance the knights from the political intrigues of the court, while the transition solidified, with the formal translation to Tomar occurring in 1357. On the day the bull was promulgated in the Cathedral of Lisbon, the former Templars lined up to exchange their white mantles with the red cross for the new habit bearing the cross of Christ, many of them simply the same men who had been Knights of the Temple a decade earlier, their collective memory and institutional identity uninterrupted by the legal shell around them. The final stroke of Dinis' maneuver was the financial settlement that accompanied the transfer, because the bull explicitly absolved the Portuguese Templars and their properties from all the judicial costs that had devoured the French treasure, stating that the new order received the goods free and clear of any encumbrance, a phrase that protected the massive landholdings from papal taxation and royal seizure. This meant that while the Hospitallers in France were sinking under the weight of debt to Philip's treasury, the Order of Christ in Portugal started with a clean ledger, owning thousands of hectares of agricultural land, dozens of castles, mills, salt pans, olive groves, vineyards and the feudal rents of entire towns. An economic powerhouse that would take only a few decades to turn into the largest institutional investor in Portuguese maritime. To measure the magnitude of what Dom Dinis preserved, we need to walk through the actual inventory of Templar assets in Portugal at the moment of transfer, a document of dry figures that, read correctly, reveals a kingdom within the kingdom. The centerpiece was the castle and convent of Tomar, built from 1160 by the Grand Master Gualdem Pius on a strategic hill overlooking the Nabeiro River, a fortress so formidable that it withstood the great Almohad siege of 1190, when the Moorish Caliph Yaqub al-Mansur hurled his entire army against its walls and failed to break the Templar garrison. At its heart stood the Charola, the octagonal rotunda modeled on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, a round nave surrounded by an ambulatory where knights on horseback could attend Mass before riding into battle, a liturgy of war that fused monastic discipline with crusading violence. Around this sacred core, the conventual buildings included dormitories, refectories, chapter houses, scriptoria and granaries, forming a self-sufficient community of 60 to 80 knights, plus sergeants, servants and chaplains, the whole complex surrounded by a double circuit of walls with towers that commanded the surrounding plain for miles in every direction. Beyond Tomar, the Templar network spanned the entire central region of Portugal, with the impregnable castle of Almoral perched on a granite island in the middle of the Tagus River, a postcard sentinel that controlled river traffic between Lisbon and the interior and served as a signal station for the line of fortresses. To the north, the castle of Papal guarded the route from Coimbra, its massive keep still bearing the marks of Templar military architecture, while Monsanto, built on a peak of enormous boulders, was considered so unassailable that it became a symbol of the order's endurance, its silhouette blending with the natural rock formations. The commandery of Castelo Branco anchored the eastern frontier facing Castile. Idanja of Velha controlled the Roman road network, and Sour, one of the first Templar donations in Portugal, functioned as an agricultural hub producing wheat, barley and wine that generated the rents needed to arm and provision the knights. The total number of Templar preceptories in Portugal has been estimated at 17 major houses and dozens of smaller dependencies, estates and churches, covering an area that, if superimposed on a modern map, would stretch from the Atlantic coast near Peniche to the Spanish border, and from the Mondego Valley to the northern Alentejo. The economic structure of these commanderies was astonishingly sophisticated, functioning not as feudal backwaters but as agricultural enterprises that deployed the latest techniques in irrigation, crop rotation and land reclamation, learned from the Cistercians and the Moors alike. The Templars drained marshes along the lower Mondego and Tagus, introduced the cultivation of rice and citrus fruits, operated tidal mills on the coastal rivers and managed salt pans in the Aveiro Lagoon and the Sado estuary that generated revenues equal to entire noble estates. Their archives, meticulously kept in the Torre do Tombo in Lisbon before its later fire and reconstruction, recorded the minutiae of tenancy contracts, livestock counts, wool production and olive oil pressing, creating a data set of economic intelligence that the Crown could consult when planning national fiscal policy. It was this institutional knowledge, as much as the land itself, that Dinis was determined to keep, because destroying the Templar administration would have meant rebuilding from scratch the very mechanisms that allowed the state to function, a task that would have cost the treasury more than any short-term confiscation could yield. The human capital was equally precious, because the Templar knights in Portugal were not the decadent courtiers of French caricature but seasoned frontier warriors, many of them drawn from the minor nobility of the Beira and Extremadura provinces, who had spent their lives patrolling the Raya against Castilian incursions and the southern littoral against Barbary corsairs. When they exchanged their mantles for the Order of Christ, they brought with them 40 years of military experience, an intimate knowledge of the terrain, and the doctrinal discipline of a religious order that imposed obedience, chastity and poverty, at least in theory, which made them reliable officers for any royal enterprise. The first master of the Order of Christ, Dom Gil Martins, had been a Templar commander and moved seamlessly into his new role, ensuring that there was no disruption in the chain of command or the transmission of the Order's traditions, a continuity that would prove essential when a prince from the royal family took the helm a century later. With the assets secured, Dom Dinis could now turn his attention to what we would today call the rebranding of the Order, a process that required the construction of a new symbolic language to distinguish the Order of Christ from its Templar past while retaining the emotional and spiritual power of the crusading ideal. The new insignia was a red cross with expanded and indented extremities, often enclosed within a white field, a design that evolved over the next 2 centuries into the iconic cross of the Portuguese discoveries, which would be painted on the sails of every caravel that left the Tagus bound for Africa, Brazil and the East. The habit adopted was a white tunic with a black scapular, following the Cistercian model, and the knights took the 3 monastic vows under the rule of Saint Benedict as interpreted by the Cistercian reform, with the added 4th vow of military service against the infidel, creating a synthesis of contemplation and action that fit perfectly with the dual nature of the Portuguese expansion, which combined missionary zeal with commercial ambition. The financial base of the Order of Christ was further strengthened by a series of papal privileges that John XXI granted in the bull Eximi Devotionis of 1320, which allowed the order to collect the quota of all ecclesiastical revenues in the kingdom intended for the crusade, a tenth of the tithes, and the redemption of captives, funds that had been collected since the early Reconquista. This meant that, in addition to its own rents, the order received a permanent stream of income from the entire Portuguese church, a fiscal privilege that made it, alongside the crown, the largest economic actor in the country, and gave it the liquidity to finance not just military campaigns but long-term investments in shipyards and navigation technology. When we add to this the spiritual indulgences granted to benefactors who contributed to the Order's war effort, we see a full-spectrum financial machine capable of mobilizing capital from the peasant's copper coin to the nobleman's legacy bequest, a machine that would power the caravels for the next 200 years. The true genius of the transfer, however, lay not in the money but in the legal fiction that allowed Portugal to have its cake and eat it, because to the papacy the Order of Christ was a new creation, a fresh foundation obedient to Rome and entirely distinct from the condemned temple, while to the Portuguese it was simply the same knights in a different uniform, with the same castles, the same lands and the same mission, minus the international political baggage that had crushed the temple. This ambiguity was deliberately cultivated in royal correspondence, where the knights were sometimes referred to as the Brothers of the Order of Christ, formerly of the Temple, a phrase that acknowledged the continuity while respecting the canonical prohibition against reviving the outlawed organization. The result was that Portugal absorbed the entire Templar infrastructure without paying a single maravedi in judicial costs, while simultaneously gaining the moral prestige of having obeyed the papal authority and founded a new Crusader order at the express request of the Holy See, a diplomatic double play that has few parallels in medieval history. When we speak of the divided Templar treasure, it is impossible not to draw a direct comparison with the fate of the Order's wealth in France, where the events that unfolded between the arrests of 1307 and the execution of Jacques de Molay in 1314 provide the shadow that makes the Portuguese case shine so brightly. The French treasury under Philip the Fair was permanently hungry, drained by wars with Flanders, England and Aquitaine, by the construction of the magnificent palace on the Isle de la Cite, and by the need to subsidize a sprawling bureaucracy of baillis, seneschals and legistes who maintained royal authority across a kingdom still only loosely integrated. The king's debt to the temple was so massive that contemporary chroniclers estimated it at 500,000 livres tournois, an astronomical sum equivalent to many times the annual revenue of the crown, and the arrests on that October Friday were designed not merely to eliminate a creditor but to seize the creditor's entire banking operation and declare the debt void by papal fiat. Once the brothers were in chains, Philip's agents took control of the Paris temple, which served as the kingdom's de facto central bank, and immediately began inventorying the chests, strongboxes and account books, while the king's ministers spread to the provincial preceptories of Pains, Provence, Caen and Bordeaux to repeat the process. The infamous judicial costs that the crown imposed on the liquidation are detailed in a series of accounts preserved in the Trésor des Chartes, which show that the hospitallers were charged for every day of the trials, for the food and lodging of the prisoners, for the transportation of documents, for the salaries of the commissioners and guards, and even for the faggots used to burn relapsed knights at the stake. The total bill was calculated by the Royal Chamber of Accounts at 200,000 livres tournois, a sum so enormous that the Hospitallers were forced to borrow heavily from Italian bankers to pay it, mortgaging their own assets to satisfy a crown that was simultaneously their supposed benefactor and their actual plunderer. As noted by historian Helen Nicholson, the transfer in France was essentially a forced sale in which the buyer paid the seller's inflated expenses and inherited properties that had already been stripped of everything portable, from the chalices on the altars to the lead on the roofs. The contrast with Portugal's free and clear reception could not be more absolute. The French crown treated the Templar wealth as a finite resource to be consumed immediately, while the Portuguese crown treated it as a capital endowment to be managed for perpetual income, a difference in economic philosophy that determined the divergent trajectories of the two states for centuries. The human cost of the French approach was equally devastating, because the torture and execution of the leaders, including the immolation of Grand Master Jacques de Molay and the preceptor of Normandy Geoffroy de Charnay on March 18, 1314, eliminated the very institutional memory that might have guided a reformed order, scattering the survivors into monasteries, hospitals, and anonymous retirement. Those who confessed under duress were condemned to perpetual imprisonment, those who maintained their innocence were burned as relapsed heretics, and even those who were absolved were forbidden to wear the habit or associate with each other, a policy of complete annihilation that left no cadre of experienced knights to pass on their skills to a successor organization. The most able, if Dom Dinis was the legal architect of the Order of Christ, the man who would transform it from a frontier militia into the engine of planetary exploration was an infante of the royal blood born almost a century later, on March 4, 1394 in the city of Porto, Dom Enrique, known to the world as Prince Henry the Navigator. He was the third son of King John I, the founder of the Avish dynasty, and Philippa of Lancaster, daughter of John of Gaunt, a union that bound Portugal to England in the oldest alliance in the world and infused the Portuguese court with a chivalric and crusading ethos drawn from the Arthurian romances. Henry was educated in the Cathedral School of Lisbon, where he studied mathematics, astronomy, and the classical geographers, Ptolemy, Strabo, and Pomponius Mela, absorbing the idea that Africa might be circumnavigable and that a Christian kingdom ruled by the legendary Prester John existed somewhere beyond the Sahara, a vision that would dominate his entire life. In 1420, at the age of 26, he was appointed governor and later Grand Master of the Order of Christ by Papal Bull Edier, Bus of Pope Martin V, a position that gave him command over the Order's immense revenues, its castles, its knights, and, most critically, its maritime knowledge accumulated since the days of the Temple. The appointment was a masterstroke of the Avish dynasty, because it placed the most dynamic prince of the royal family at the head of the richest corporate entity in the kingdom, aligning the crown's strategic interests with the Order's crusading mission and creating a synergy that neither institution could have achieved alone. Henry immediately moved the Order's headquarters from the remote Castro Marim to the Templar heartland of Tomar, making the Convent of Christ his base of operations and pouring the Order's wealth into a series of expeditions that aimed to explore the coast of West Africa, find a sea route to the gold-producing regions of the Senegal and Niger rivers, and outflank the Muslim caravan trade that controlled the Saharan corridors. Between 1420 and his death in 1460, Henry sponsored between 30 and 40 voyages down the African coast, systematically pushing the limits of known geography past Cape Bojador in 1434, Cape Blanco in 1441, the Senegal River in 1444 and Sierra Leone in 1460, a cumulative advance of over 4,000 kilometers of previously unknown coastline. Each expedition equipped and financed by the Order of Christ and flying its distinctive cross on the lateen sails. The first great psychological barrier was Cape Bojador, located at latitude 26 degrees north on the coast of what is now Western Sahara, a headland surrounded by shallow reefs and violent currents where the sea seemed to boil and legends claimed that no ship could pass and return. Between 1424 and 1433, Henry sent 15 expeditions, all of which turned back at the sight of the boiling waters, until in 1434 one of his squires, Gilleans, a native of Lagos in the Algarve, finally solved the problem by swinging wide to the west into the open ocean before turning south, demonstrating that the cape could be rounded by avoiding the coastal shallows. This breakthrough, however small it may seem on a modern map, was a Copernican revolution in the mental geography of the age, proving that the ancients and the Arab geographers were wrong, that the torrid zone was not uninhabitable, and that the Atlantic held a continuous passage to the south. When Innes returned to Sagres, Henry received him with the honors of a conquering hero, and the legend of the navigator was born, even if Henry himself never captained a ship or sailed farther than Ceuta in his entire life. The economic logic of the expeditions was driven by a double imperative: the need to find gold to remedy the chronic bullion shortage that afflicted medieval Europe, and the desire to tap the West African slave trade as a source of labor for the sugar plantations being developed on the newly discovered Atlantic islands of Madeira and the Azores. The Order of Christ received the spiritual jurisdiction over all newly discovered lands by the Bull Romanus Pontifex of 1455, issued by Pope Nicholas V, which granted Portugal a monopoly on navigation south of Cape Bojador and all territories to the Indies, with the explicit mandate to convert the inhabitants to Christianity. Henry used the bull to award the captains of each expedition a percentage of the profits in slaves, gold dust, Malagueta pepper and ivory, creating a profit-sharing model that attracted private investors from the Genoese, Florentine and Portuguese merchant communities, who co-financed voyages under the order's patronage. The slave trade, which we rightly condemn today, was seen by Henry as a means to an end, both a source of funding for further exploration and a way to baptize Africans into Christianity, a rationalization that he expounded in his letters to the Pope and that reveals the uncomfortable fusion of crusading idealism and commercial exploitation that powered the discoveries. Henry established his famous center of operations on the windswept promontory of Sagres, near the Cape of St. Vincent, the southwesternmost point of Europe, where he founded a school of cartography, navigation and ship design that attracted the best astronomical minds of the Mediterranean, including the Majorcan cartographer Jehuda Cresques, the son of the creator of the famous Catalan Atlas of 1375. At Sagres, the caravel was perfected, a light, maneuverable vessel of 20 to 30 meters in length, with 2 or 3 lateen sails that allowed it to sail closer to the wind than any previous ship, capable of exploring shallow coastal waters and beating back against the prevailing northerly winds of the African coast. The navita, or magnetic compass, was systematically tested, astrolabes were adapted from the Arabs for use at sea, and the quadrant was refined to measure the altitude of the pole star, allowing navigators to fix their latitude with a precision that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. The accumulated knowledge was recorded in secret portolan charts, updated after each voyage, that became the most jealously guarded state secret in Portugal, the loss of a single chart to a rival power being considered a capital crime. The cross of the Order of Christ became the emblem of this entire enterprise, painted in bold red on the white lateen sails of every ship that departed under Henry's license, a symbol that proclaimed to every port and every coast that the vessel operated under the dual authority of the Crown and the Papal mandate to spread the faith and explore the unknown. When the caravels reached the mouth of the Senegal River and made contact with the Wolof kingdoms, the captains raised the cross on the beaches, held Mass, and claimed the land in the name of Christ and the King of Portugal, a ritual of possession that combined medieval crusading ceremonies with the legal formalities of the Roman law doctrine of terra nullius. The order's knights served as captains, pilots, cartographers and chroniclers, men like Lancarote de Freitas, who led a slaving expedition to Arguim in 1444, or Dinis Dias, who discovered Cape Verde in 1444, each of them bringing back not only prophets, but detailed logs that added to the growing corpus of geographical intelligence stored at the Convent of Christ. The culmination of Henry's vision did not occur in his lifetime, for he died on November 13, 1460 at Sagres, but the momentum he generated was unstoppable, and in 1488 Bartolome Dias, sailing under the flag of the Order of Christ, rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, opening the sea route to the Indian Ocean. A decade later, in 1498, Vasco da Gama, himself a Knight of the Order of Christ, crossed the Indian Ocean and reached Calicut on the Malabar coast of India, shattering the Arab-Venetian monopoly on the spice trade and establishing the first direct maritime link between Europe and the Indian subcontinent. The Order's cross fluttered from the mast of his flagship, the São Gabriel, a visible reminder that the voyage was not a private venture but the mission of a military-religious corporation that could trace its unbroken lineage to the Templars who had built the castles of Portugal 2.5 centuries earlier. When the spices of the East began to flow into Lisbon, the Templar treasure had finally transmuted from gold and silver into something far more precious: control of the arteries of global commerce. The Convent of Christ in Tomar, the beating heart of the order, deserves a chapter of its own, because the stones of this extraordinary complex tell the entire history of the transformation from Templar fortress to Manueline palace, from Crusader redoubt to the spiritual headquarters of a global empire. The original Templar castle, founded in 1160 by Gualdum Pius, was laid out as a Roman castrum with 8 towers and a central courtyard, but its most remarkable feature was the charola, the octagonal rotunda begun in the late 12th century and completed around 1195, inspired directly by the Anastasis of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. The charola was not a parish church but an oratory reserved for the knights, with a high central altar surrounded by a circular ambulatory, the walls covered in polychrome paintings of biblical scenes, saints, and, significantly, the instruments of the Passion, all executed in a Byzantine-influenced style that reminded the brothers of their order's origin in the Holy Land. The vaulted ceiling soared to the heavens, and the light entered through narrow windows in the drum, creating an atmosphere of numinous, claustrophobic intensity that prepared the night for the sacrifice of battle and the promise of resurrection. When the Order of Christ took over the complex in 1357, under the mastership of Dom Nuno Rodriguez, the convent began its slow architectural metamorphosis, adding a Gothic cloister, a chapter house, and the dormitories that would house a growing community of knights, chaplains, and lay brothers. The real transformation, however, came under the governorship of Prince Henry in the 15th century, who built the cloister of the Wash, where the ritual purification before entering the charola took place, and the cloister of the cemetery, where the knights were buried beneath slabs carved with the cross of the order. Henry's rooms were located in the Alcacova, the former Templar governor's residence, modest chambers with a view over the valley, where he received the reports of his captains, studied the Port Oland charts and dictated the instructions for the next expedition, never losing sight of the crusading ideal even as the commercial returns from Africa began to pour into the treasury. The convent was thus not a museum but a living headquarters, buzzing with clerks, messengers, shipwrights and pilots, a place where the sacred and the practical coexisted in the same corridors, where a mass celebrated for the soul of a dead navigator might be interrupted by the arrival of a courier with news of a new landfall. The great age of construction, however, began after the return of Vasco da Gama from India in 1499, when King Manuel I, the Fortunate, decided to commemorate the discovery with a complete renovation of the convent that would become the manifesto of the Manueline style, a uniquely Portuguese fusion of late Gothic, Renaissance, and maritime ornamental motifs. Manuel was himself the Grand Master of the Order of Christ, as the mastership had been permanently annexed to the crown in 1495, and he poured the fabulous wealth of the Indies into the convent, commissioning the architect Diogo da Ruda to build the famous chapter house window, the Janela do Capitulo, the most celebrated piece of Manueline architecture in Portugal. The window is a riot of marine and vegetable sculpture, ropes, cables, anchors, cork oak branches, artichokes and coral, intertwined with the cross of the Order of Christ and the armillary sphere, the emblem of King Manuel, all carved in the local limestone with a virtuosity that seems to dissolve stone into seaweed and foam. The symbolic message is unmistakable. The order that had inherited the Templar mandate now ruled the oceans, and the Convent of Christ was its terrestrial palace, a place where every knot and cable of the caravels was sacralized in stone. The other great addition was the immense Manueline nave, begun by Diogo de Arruda and completed by João de Castillo, who also designed the Geronimo's Monastery in Lisbon, a hall church of soaring height where the knights of the order could gather in their hundreds, a space so vast that it seemed to celebrate the boundlessness of the new worlds being annexed to Christendom. The vaults, supported by spiraling columns that evoke twisted ropes, are studded with the cross of the order and the royal coats of arms, while the light enters through enormous windows that flood the interior with the Atlantic sun, a stark contrast to the dark, introspective charola next door. This juxtaposition of the Romanesque rotunda and the Manueline nave, each belonging to a different stage of the order's history, encapsulates the entire argument of our video. The Templar rotunda represents the enclosed, crusading world of the medieval knight, fighting for the Holy Sepulchre, while the vast nave represents the open, imperial world of the Age of Discoveries, where the same knights sailed to the ends of the earth under the same cross, their mission expanded but their identity unbroken. The convent also houses a series of Renaissance cloisters added in the 16th century by the order of King John III, who continued the patronage of his predecessor, including the majestic cloister of John III, designed by Diogo de Torralva, which introduced the pure classical style to Portugal and served as the model for the great royal cloisters of Spain and Italy. In the upper galleries, the cells of the knights opened onto balconies overlooking the central garden, each cell a small study with a desk, a bookshelf and a prie-dieu, where the brother could read his breviary, study the latest navigational manual, or write his own account of the voyage from which he had just returned. The library of the convent amassed thousands of volumes, including the works of Ptolemy, Alfraganus, Sacrobosco and the Jewish cartographers of Majorca, as well as the secret reports of the pilots, the roteros, that described the coasts, currents, winds and harbors of Africa, Brazil and Asia, a collection so valuable that foreign spies repeatedly tried to bribe the librarian for access. In this sense, the Convent of Christ was the memory bank of the Portuguese Empire, the place where the nation's most valuable intellectual property was stored and disseminated to the captains who sailed under the order's flag. The decline of the convent as a living headquarters began in the 18th century, when the Enlightenment Marquis of Pombal secularized much of the order's administration and the Napoleonic invasion saw the building occupied and partially sacked by French troops. But the greatest threat came in 1834, when the liberal government abolished all religious orders in Portugal and the convent was emptied of its monks. For decades, the vast complex stood in majestic abandonment, visited only by romantic travelers like the English writer William Beckford, who described the moonlit charola as a vision of Arabian Nights grafted onto the Gothic north, a phrase that captures the syncretic magic of the place. Restoration began in the early 20th century, and in 1983 the Convent of Christ was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized not only for its architectural splendor but for its unique testimony to the transmission of the crusading ideal from the medieval temple to the modern discoveries, a story told in every stone, every cloister, every cross carved into the walls. When visitors walk through the charola today and see the high altar where Templar knights once knelt in their white mantles, and then step into the great nave where the men who had sailed to Japan and Brazil celebrated their triumphs, they are walking through the only place on earth where the entire arc of the Templar saga, from the Holy Land to the oceans of the planet, can be experienced as a single, uninterrupted narrative. The Convent of Christ in Tomar, the beating heart of the order, deserves a chapter of its own, because the stones of this extraordinary complex tell the entire history of the transformation from Templar fortress to Manueline palace, from Crusader redoubt to the spiritual headquarters of a global empire. The original Templar castle, founded in 1160 by Gualdon Pius, was laid out as a Roman castrum with 8 towers and a central courtyard, but its most remarkable feature was the charola. The octagonal rotunda began in the late 12th century and completed around 1195, inspired directly by the Anastasis of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. The charola was not a parish church but an oratory reserved for the knights, with a high central altar surrounded by a circular ambulatory, the walls covered in polychrome paintings of biblical scenes, saints, and, significantly, the instruments of the Passion, all executed in a Byzantine-influenced style that reminded the brothers of their order's origin in the Holy Land. The vaulted ceiling soared to the heavens, and the light entered through narrow windows in the drum, creating an atmosphere of numinous, claustrophobic intensity that prepared the night for the sacrifice of battle and the promise of resurrection. When the Order of Christ took over the complex in 1357, under the mastership of Dom Nuno Rodriguez, the convent began its slow architectural metamorphosis, adding a Gothic cloister, a chapter house, and the dormitories that would house a growing community of knights, chaplains, and lay brothers. The real transformation, however, came under the governorship of Prince Henry in the 15th century, who built the cloister of the Wash, where the ritual purification before entering the charola took place, and the cloister of the cemetery, where the knights were buried beneath slabs carved with the cross of the order. Henry's rooms were located in the Alcacova, the former Templar governor's residence, modest chambers with a view over the valley, where he received the reports of his captains, studied the Port-Oland charts and dictated the instructions for the next expedition, never losing sight of the crusading ideal even as the commercial returns from Africa began to pour into the treasury. The convent was thus not a museum but a living headquarters, buzzing with clerks, messengers, shipwrights and pilots, a place where the sacred and the practical coexisted in the same corridors, where a mass celebrated for the soul of a dead navigator might be interrupted by the arrival of a courier with news of a new landfall. The great age of construction, however, began after the return of Vasco da Gama from India in 1499, when King Manuel I, the Fortunate, decided to commemorate the discovery with a complete renovation of the convent that would become the manifesto of the Manueline style, a uniquely Portuguese fusion of late Gothic, Renaissance, and maritime ornamental motifs. Manuel was himself the Grand Master of the Order of Christ, as the mastership had been permanently annexed to the crown in 1495, and he poured the fabulous wealth of the Indies into the convent, commissioning the architect Diogo da Ruda to build the famous chapter house window, the Janela do Capitulo, the most celebrated piece of Manueline architecture in Portugal. The window is a riot of marine and vegetable sculpture, ropes, cables, anchors, cork oak branches, artichokes and coral, intertwined with the cross of the Order of Christ and the armillary sphere, the emblem of King Manuel, all carved in the local limestone with a virtuosity that seems to dissolve stone into seaweed and foam. The symbolic message is unmistakable. The order that had inherited the Templar mandate now ruled the oceans, and the convent of Christ was its terrestrial palace, a place where every knot and cable of the caravels was sacralized in stone. The other great addition was the immense Manueline nave, begun by Diogo da Ruda and completed by João de Castillo, who also designed the Geronimo's Monastery in Lisbon, a hall church of soaring height where the knights of the order could gather in their hundreds, a space so vast that it seemed to celebrate the boundlessness of the new worlds being annexed to Christendom. The vaults, supported by spiraling columns that evoke twisted ropes, are studded with the cross of the order and the royal coats of arms, while the light enters through enormous windows that flood the interior with the Atlantic sun, a stark contrast to the dark, introspective charola next door. This juxtaposition of the Romanesque rotunda and the Manueline nave, each belonging to a different stage of the order's history, encapsulates the entire argument of our video. The Templar rotunda represents the enclosed, crusading world of the medieval knight, fighting for the Holy Sepulchre, while the vast nave represents the open, imperial world of the Age of Discoveries, where the same knights sailed to the ends of the earth under the same cross, their mission expanded but their identity unbroken. The convent also houses a series of Renaissance cloisters added in the 16th century by the order of King John III, who continued the patronage of his predecessor, including the majestic cloister of John III, designed by Diogo de Torralva, which introduced the pure classical style to Portugal and served as the model for the great royal cloisters of Spain and Italy. In the upper galleries, the cells of the knights opened onto balconies overlooking the central garden, each cell a small study with a desk, a bookshelf and a prie-dieu, where the brother could read his breviary, study the latest navigational manual, or write his own account of the voyage from which he had just returned. The library of the convent amassed thousands of volumes, including the works of Ptolemy, Alfraganus, Sacrobosco and the Jewish cartographers of Majorca, as well as the secret reports of the pilots, the roteros, that described the coasts, currents, winds and harbors of Africa, Brazil and Asia, a collection so valuable that foreign spies repeatedly tried to bribe the librarian for access. In this sense, the Convent of Christ was the memory bank of the Portuguese Empire, the place where the nation's most valuable intellectual property was stored and disseminated to the captains who sailed under the order's flag. The decline of the convent as a living headquarters began in the 18th century, when the Enlightenment Marquis of Pombal secularized much of the order's administration and the Napoleonic invasion saw the building occupied and partially sacked by French troops. But the greatest threat came in 1834, when the liberal government abolished all religious orders in Portugal and the convent was emptied of its monks. For decades, the vast complex stood in majestic abandonment, visited only by romantic travelers like the English writer William Beckford, who described the moonlit charola as a vision of Arabian Nights grafted onto the Gothic north, a phrase that captures the syncretic magic of the place. Restoration began in the early 20th century, and in 1983 the Convent of Christ was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized not only for its architectural splendor but for its unique testimony to the transmission of the crusading ideal from the medieval temple to the modern discoveries, a story told in every stone, every cloister, every cross carved into the walls. When visitors walk through the charola today and see the high altar where Templar knights once knelt in their white mantles, and then step into the great nave where the men who had sailed to Japan and Brazil celebrated their triumphs, they are walking through the only place on earth where the entire arc of the Templar saga, from the Holy Land to the oceans of the planet, can be experienced as a single, uninterrupted narrative. The legal and political continuity between the Temple and the Order of Christ was not merely a matter of castles and revenues but extended to the very conceptual framework that legitimized Portuguese expansion, a framework built on the crusading bulls that had originally licensed the Templars to wage holy war against the infidel. When Pope Nicholas V issued the bull Romanus Pontifex on January 8, 1455, he granted to King Afonso V, his uncle Prince Henry, and the Order of Christ the exclusive right to navigate, conquer and trade in all lands south of Cape Bojador, extending to the Indies, with the explicit obligation to convert the inhabitants to the Catholic faith. The bulls cited the earlier grants to the Templars and the Hospitallers as precedents, creating a direct jurisprudential lineage that made the Order of Christ the spiritual heir of the crusading mandates that had launched the First Crusade in 1095. This meant that every Portuguese caravel that sailed down the African coast, every captain who erected a stone padreo on a newly discovered beach, every settlement that claimed a bay or an estuary, was acting under a papal license that could be traced, through the Order of Christ, to the Templar bulls of the 12th century. An unbroken chain of legal authorization that gave Portugal's imperial project a moral and legal legitimacy that no other European power could match until the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed on June 7, 1494 between Portugal and Castile, divided the non-Christian world into two hemispheres of influence along a meridian 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, a line that gave Portugal a claim to Brazil, which was officially discovered by Pedro Álvares Cabral in 1500 under the flag of the Order of Christ. The treaty was mediated by Pope Alexander VI, who issued the bull Intercitera in 1493, but the Portuguese negotiators insisted that the bull be modified to reference the prior rights of the Order of Christ, ensuring that the Brazilian claim was not merely a political agreement, but a continuation of the crusading mission entrusted to the order. Cabral's fleet, which carried the cross of Christ on its sails, included several knights of the order among its captains and pilots, and the first Mass celebrated on the shores of what would become Brazil, on April 26, 1500, was conducted by Friar Enrique de Coimbra under a cross of the order erected on the beach of Porto Seguro. The land was named Ilha de Vera Cruz, Island of the True Cross, a name that explicitly linked the discovery to the mission of the order, and the first letter sent back to King Manuel, written by the scribe Pero Vaz de Camina, describes the ceremony in language rich with crusading imagery, emphasizing the obligation to save the souls of the indigenous Tupi people by bringing them into the fold of the Church. The role of the Order of Christ in the administration of the Portuguese Empire grew over the 16th century, with the mastership of the order being permanently annexed to the crown in 1495 by the bull Praecelsi Devotionis of Pope Alexander VI, which made the king the perpetual governor and administrator of the order, fusing the highest temporal and spiritual authorities of the state into a single office. This meant that every colony, every fortress, every trading post from Malacca to Macau was under the dual jurisdiction of the royal governor and the Order of Christ, which collected tithes, appointed chaplains, and supervised the construction of churches, hospitals and schools in the overseas territories. The order's cross was stamped on the coinage of the empire, carved on the gateways of the fortresses of Sofala, Mombasa, Goa and Ormuz, and flown on the ships that plied the monsoon routes of the Indian Ocean, a ubiquitous symbol that reminded every sailor and soldier that he served not only the king but Christ himself, under a mandate that reached back to the Templar Knights who had defended the pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. The financial structure of the overseas empire was intimately bound up with the order's revenues, because the crown relied on the order's preceptories in Portugal as a source of credit and investment capital for the Indian voyages, using the income from the vast estates of Tomar, Santarém, and Alcobaça as collateral for loans from the Florentine and Genoese bankers who financed the spice fleets. The order's own fleet, the Nos de Ordem, was a separate squadron within the Indian Armada, commanded by knights of the order and used to transport the spices, silks, and precious stones that filled the treasury of the Convent of Christ and the Royal Palace in Lisbon. The Casa de India, the state trading house established in 1503 to manage the monopoly on Asian goods, was located in the Ribeira Palace in Lisbon, but its ledgers were audited by officials of the order, and a portion of its profits was always earmarked for the maintenance of the convent, the support of missionary work, and the redemption of Christian captives in Muslim lands, maintaining the charitable and military dimensions of the crusading ethos even in the age of commercial capitalism. The intellectual property of the order, the accumulated geographical knowledge that had been gathered since the days of Prince Henry, remained a state secret of the highest order, protected by the penalty of death for anyone who leaked portolan charts or roteros to foreign powers. The Royal Cosmographer, an office held by mathematicians and astronomers like Pedro Nunes and João Baptista Lavanja, was a Knight of the Order of Christ, and the maps produced in his office were kept in the secret archive of the Convent of Tomar, accessible only to the Grand Master and his most trusted captains. This archive, known as the Livraria do Infante, the Prince's Library, contained not only the nautical charts but the diplomatic correspondence, the treaties, the instructions to Viceroy. If we pull back the lens from Portugal to survey the wider European canvas, the fate of the Templar treasure in the other kingdoms of Christendom offers a series of moral and economic lessons that sharpen our understanding of why Portugal alone succeeded in capitalizing on the legacy. In the Kingdom of Aragon, which included Catalonia, Valencia, and the Balearic Islands, the Templars had been deeply involved in the Reconquista against the Moors of Valencia and Murcia and held a string of formidable castles, including Monzon, Miravet, and Peníscola, the last a sea-girt fortress so strong that it would later serve as the refuge of the schismatic Pope Benedict XIII. When the arrests were ordered in 1308, King James II of Aragon initially resisted, arguing that the Templars were essential for the defense of the frontier. But under pressure from the Pope and Philip of France, he eventually complied, though the knights were allowed to defend themselves in a formal trial conducted by the Council of Tarragona in 1312, which found them innocent of all charges. The outcome, however, was not the creation of a new order but the distribution of the Templar properties to the Hospitallers and the creation of the Aragonese Order of Montesa in 1317, which received part of the Templar lands in the Kingdom of Valencia but on a much smaller scale and with limited maritime projection, never achieving the global reach of the Order of Christ. The Kingdom of Castile, which by the early 14th century was the dominant power in the Iberian Peninsula, had an even more pragmatic approach, because the Templars had been concentrated in the fortified towns of the Central Plateau, such as Avila, Segovia, and Toledo, and their dissolution offered a golden opportunity for the crown and the powerful noble families to seize strategic assets without provoking a papal confrontation. The Castilian Templars were subjected to a trial by the Archbishop of Compostela in 1310, and like their Portuguese brothers, they were found innocent, but instead of being reconstituted as a single order, their castles were absorbed into the royal domain or granted to the secular nobility, the Order of Santiago, and the Hospitallers in a mosaic of local arrangements. The most emblematic case is the Castle of Ponferrada, a massive Templar fortress on the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela, which was given to the Count of Lemos, and then changed hands repeatedly through inheritance and sale, its military value diluted in the dynastic politics of the Castilian aristocracy. The lesson is clear: where the state was already strong and the nobility dominant, the Templar inheritance was fragmented and privatized, but where the state was still consolidating, as in Portugal, the crown could concentrate the assets in a new institution that served national, rather than factional, interests. The Italian peninsula presents yet another pattern because the Templars there were heavily involved in banking and the administration of papal finances, and their properties, concentrated in Rome, Naples, Sicily, and the maritime republics, were transferred to the Hospitallers with relatively little conflict. Since the Italian states had no need for a frontier military order, and were already developing the sophisticated commercial capitalism that would fund the Renaissance. The Temple Church in Rome, San Pietro in Vincoli, and the Templar Palace in Palermo were simply incorporated into the Hospitaller network, and the Italian brothers were absorbed into other religious orders or returned to secular life without the drama that characterized the French dissolution. The only exception was the island of Cyprus, which had been the headquarters of the Order of the Temple after the fall of Acre in 1291, and where the Templars had immense possessions, including the castle of Gastria and the great commandery of Limassol. After the dissolution, the Hospitallers, who already ruled the island of Rhodes, absorbed the Cypriot Templar estates and used them to strengthen their own naval power in the eastern Mediterranean, a transfer that preserved the military function of the assets but subsumed them into a rival order that had its own distinct identity and no interest in carrying the Templar name forward. Once again, Portugal stands alone in having created a genuinely new but filially linked institution that continued the Templar mission under a new banner. The German lands in Eastern Europe tell a story of even greater fragmentation, because the Templars had been present in the Holy Roman Empire since the 12th century, with important commanderies in Cologne, Frankfurt, and Berlin. But the political chaos of the Great Interregnum and the rise of the Teutonic Knights meant that the Templar dissolution was a sideshow to the much larger conflict between the Teutonic Order and the Kingdom of Poland. The German Templars were tried by local bishops, and many of them were acquitted or given light penances, but no attempt was made to create a new national order, because the Teutonic Knights already monopolized the concept of a German military religious corporation, and the Hospitallers were content to absorb the Templar estates into their own priorates. The consequence was that when the Age of Discoveries began, the German states had no institutional link to the Templar legacy that could be deployed for overseas expansion, and their eventual colonial empires in Africa and the Pacific were built by joint stock companies and chartered societies, without the symbolic weight of a crusading order to legitimize their conquests. The Teutonic Order, for its part, transformed into a secular duchy in Prussia in 1525 and then into a noble charity, never converting its Baltic crusading experience into a global maritime project, a road not taken that further illuminates the Portuguese exception. The French case, which we have already analyzed in its financial dimensions, produced the most paradoxical outcome, because the very kingdom that had destroyed the temple with such ferocity became, a century and a half later, the birthplace of the legend that the Templars had survived in secret, a legend that has had a cultural impact far greater than the mere transfer of properties ever could. The execution of Jacques de Molay and the curse he supposedly pronounced on Philip the Fair and Pope Clement V, calling them to appear before the tribunal of God within a year, created a myth of Templar vengeance that seemed to be fulfilled when both men died within the year, Philip on November 29, 1314 and Clement on April 20, 1314, though the dates do not perfectly align with the legend. The myth grew in the underground currents of esoteric Freemasonry, which in the 18th century adopted the Templars as spiritual ancestors, claiming that the order had secretly preserved ancient wisdom and hidden relics from the Temple of Solomon, a narrative that found its most elaborate expression in the writings of the Scottish Freemason Andrew Michael Ramsay and the German occultist Karl von Hund. This mythical Templar tradition, entirely disconnected from the historical Order of Christ, has generated an immense popular culture, from the novels of Sir Walter Scott to the films of Hollywood, but it has also obscured the real story of institutional survival in Portugal, which is far more concrete and far less romantic than the tales of hidden vaults and secret rituals. The final piece of the European puzzle is the Papal States themselves, where the Templar dissolution was, in theory, most straightforward because the Pope was the sovereign lord of the order and could dispose of its properties by fiat. Yet even here, the reality was messy, because the Templar estates around Rome, in the provinces of Campania and Marittima, were heavily indebted and their management had been chaotic, and the Hospitallers were reluctant to take on liabilities that exceeded the assets. The papal treasury itself received little direct benefit, because Clement V and his successors were more concerned with the political implications of the transfer than with the financial details, and the pontiffs were careful not to be seen as profiteering from the destruction of an order that had once been the right arm of the papacy. The true beneficiary of the Templar dissolution in the papal orbit was not the Church but the French crown, which had blackmailed the Pope into the entire proceeding and walked away with the liquid wealth, leaving the Holy See to manage the diplomatic fallout for centuries. In this sense, the Portuguese solution was not only an economic triumph but a moral victory, because it allowed a Christian king to honor his obligations to the Holy See while simultaneously preserving the institution that had served the cross on the frontier, a synthesis of piety and pragmatism that no other European monarch achieved. To fully appreciate the scale of the intellectual transmission from Temple to Order of Christ, we must examine the specific fields of knowledge that the Templars had acquired through 2 centuries of operations in the Latin East, knowledge that was not lost but preserved and amplified in Portugal. The Templars had been, from their inception, a multilingual organization, with knights and sergeants recruited from every corner of Christendom, speaking French, Occitan, Italian, German, English, Catalan, and the various Romance dialects, as well as the Arabic and Greek acquired through their contacts with the Muslim and Byzantine worlds. This polyglot character made the order a natural clearinghouse for geographical and commercial intelligence, because a brother returning from a mission to Cairo or Damascus could brief his superiors in the language of the local souk and the caravan routes, information that was systematically recorded in the letters and reports that circulated through the order's network. When the Portuguese Templars were reorganized into the Order of Christ, this institutional habit of linguistic openness continued, and the convent of Tomar became a center for the study of Arabic, Hebrew, and the African languages encountered on the voyages, with interpreters and translators employed to decipher the navigational manuals of the Arab pilots, such as the Kitab al-Fuaidi of Ahmad ibn Majid, the most famous of the Indian Ocean navigators. The geographical knowledge that the Templars had gathered in the East was even more directly relevant to the Portuguese enterprise because the order had maintained a chain of strongholds along the caravan routes from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and its brothers had traveled as far as the Caspian, the Euphrates, and the Nile. The Templar archives, insofar as they survived the dissolution, contained descriptions of the monsoon winds, the ports of the East African coast, the spice markets of Aden and Hormuz, and the island kingdoms of Indonesia, information that was of incalculable value to a small kingdom seeking a maritime route to bypass the Muslim blockade. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, created by Abraham Cresques, the most important cartographic work of the 14th century, incorporated Templar geographical traditions alongside Arab and Jewish sources, and this atlas was studied intensively at the court of Dom Dinis and later at the school of Sagres, where Jehuda Cresques, the son of the atlas's creator, served as chief cartographer to Prince Henry. The connection is literal and provable. The man who made the most famous map of the medieval world ended his life working for the Order of Christ, passing the accumulated knowledge of the temple directly into the planning of the African voyages. The nautical technology that the Templars had developed in their Mediterranean fleet was equally critical, because the order had operated a substantial navy since the late 12th century, with bases in the ports of the Languedoc, Catalonia, and the Italian city-states, specializing in the transport of pilgrims, the escort of merchant convoys, and amphibious operations against the coastal fortresses of the Levant. The Templar ships were not the heavy galleys of the northern waters but the swift lateen-rigged vessels of the Mediterranean, capable of sailing close to the wind, and their crews included experienced pilots, shipwrights, and navigators who had mastered the use of the compass, the port-Oland chart, and the astrolabe, technologies that were transferred wholesale to the Portuguese caravels. The transition from the Templar fleet to the Order of Christ squadrons is documented in the shipbuilding contracts preserved in the Torre do Tombo, which show that the same families of shipwrights who had built for the temple in the ports of Setúbal and Lisbon continued to build for the Order of Christ, and that the design of the caravel itself was an evolutionary adaptation of the Mediterranean latiner to the conditions of the Atlantic, a fusion of Templar maritime tradition with the oceanic challenges that Portugal was the first European nation to confront. The cartographic secrecy that surrounded the Portuguese discoveries has often been attributed to the commercial imperative of protecting the spice monopoly, but its roots go deeper, into the Templar tradition of esoteric knowledge, where the guardians of sacred relics and the routes to the Holy Land treated geographical information as a spiritual and strategic trust, not to be revealed to the profane. The Templars had been masters of encryption and coded communication, using ciphers, symbols, and hidden alphabets to protect their financial transactions and diplomatic correspondence, and this culture of secrecy was inherited by the Order of Christ, which kept its port-Oland charts in locked cabinets, restricted access to the Livraria do Infante, and required oaths of confidentiality from all pilots and cartographers. When the Dutch and English rivals finally broke into the Indian Ocean at the end of the 16th century, they did so by pirating Portuguese nautical charts, and it was the intelligence contained in those charts, the secret of the westerly winds of the South Atlantic and the monsoon pattern of the Indian Ocean, that enabled the rise of the Dutch East India Company and the eventual eclipse of Portuguese power. The Templar treasure, in its most enduring form, was this informational capital, a set of navigational and geographical secrets that could make or break empires. The financial techniques that the Templars had pioneered in Europe, the letter of credit, the bill of exchange, the deposit and transfer system that allowed a pilgrim to deposit funds in Paris and withdraw them in Jerusalem, were equally fundamental to the Portuguese imperial economy, because the spice trade required the movement of enormous sums of silver and gold across continents, and the Order of Christ provided the institutional framework for a reliable transfer system. The Casa de India in Lisbon functioned as a central clearinghouse where the profits of the Asian voyages were deposited, the spices warehoused, and the payments to the crown, the order, and the private investors allocated, using accounting methods that were directly descended from the Templar practice. The order's own treasury, administered by a receiver, who answered to the Grand Master, handled the rents from the commanderies, the tithes from the churches, and the returns from the African and Brazilian ventures, reinvesting the surplus in shipbuilding, fortification, and missionary work. A perpetual cycle of capital accumulation that made the order the closest thing to a modern development bank that the 16th century could conceive. When we trace the lineage of modern financial institutions, from the Medici Bank to the Bank of England to the World Bank, it is not an exaggeration to say that the Templar banking system, preserved and adapted by the Order of Christ, is one of the missing links in that genealogy. The final and most speculative field of transmission is the navigational astronomy that the Templars may have acquired from the Arab observatories of the Middle East. Because the Arabs had been the masters of celestial navigation since the Abbasid Caliphate, and the Templar castles in Syria and Palestine were situated in regions where the works of al-Khwarizmi, al-Battani, and al-Zarqali were studied and elaborated. The astrolabe, which became the signature instrument of Portuguese navigation, was an Arab invention, and the quadrant and the cross staff were adapted from Arab prototypes, with the Portuguese versions being refined by the Jewish and Muslim astronomers who worked alongside the Christian knights at the court of Prince Henry. The Order of Christ's explicit mission to spread Christianity did not preclude a practical tolerance for the intellectual achievements of the Islamic world, and the convent of Tomar housed treatises on astronomy and mathematics that bore the names of Arab, Persian, and Jewish scholars, in Latin and Portuguese translation, side by side with the writings of the Church Fathers. This intellectual openness, born of the Templar experience in the multicultural world of the Crusader states, was one of the secret ingredients of the Portuguese success, because it allowed the small kingdom to leapfrog the medieval scholasticism of the universities of Paris and Bologna and leap directly into the empirical, open-minded science of the sea. A science that would within a century transform the globe. He reigned of King Manuel I, who ascended the throne in 1495 and ruled until 1521, marks the absolute zenith of the Order of Christ as both a spiritual military corporation and the financial engine of planetary exploration. Manuel was not merely the King of Portugal. By the bull Praecelsi Devotionis of Pope Alexander VI, issued on June 30, 1496, the mastership of the Order of Christ had been permanently annexed to the crown, a juridical masterstroke that transformed every Portuguese monarch into the living embodiment of the Templar legacy. This fusion of royal prerogative and crusading mandate meant that when Vasco da Gama returned from India in 1499, his holds bursting with pepper and cinnamon, the king received the tribute not as a secular sovereign but as the Grand Master of a holy knighthood, a dual identity that gave the Portuguese crown a sacred aura unmatched by any other European monarchy. Manuel immediately poured the windfall into a construction campaign that would make the order's symbols visible across the known world, from the Geronimo's monastery in Belém to the fortress churches of the Indian Ocean, all bearing the cross of Christ carved into portals, vaults, and altars, a stone manifesto of a kingdom convinced that God had chosen it to rule the seas. The golden tide of spices, silks, and precious stones that flooded into the Casa de India generated annual revenues estimated at 1 million cruzados by 1506, a sum equivalent to the entire budget of some European kingdoms, and a fixed percentage of every cargo, typically 10%, was automatically tied to the Order of Christ for the maintenance of its convents, the ransom of captives, and the funding of new expeditions. Manuel, a man of deep but theatrically expressed piety, saw himself as the new Solomon, the builder of the temple, and his court chroniclers, like Damio de Gois, wove a narrative in which the Order of Christ was the sacred instrument foretold by the prophets, destined to carry the cross to the ends of the earth and usher in the final age before the apocalypse. The architectural expression of this messianic vision was the Geronimo's monastery, begun in 1501 on the site of the old hermitage of Santa Maria de Belém where Vasco da Gama had spent his last night before departing for India, a building that consumed a fortune equivalent to the cost of a war, and that remains the most perfect jewel of the Manueline style. The monastery was entrusted to the Order of St. Jerome, but its construction was entirely funded by the Order of Christ from the spice revenues, and the cross of the order appears on every column, every vault boss, every sculpted portal, entwined with the armillary sphere of King Manuel, the ropes and knots of the caravels, and the exotic flora and fauna of the newly discovered continents. The south portal, designed by the master João de Castillo, is a staggering encyclopedia of marine and royal symbolism, its tympanum filled with statues of the apostles, prophets, and the Virgin of Belém, all framed by twisted columns that mimic the cables of a ship, a visual proclamation that the monastery was a vessel of the faith, anchored on the Tagus shore, poised to sail into eternity. Manuel himself retired often to the Geronimos to pray before the tomb of Vasco da Gama, which he commissioned in the main chapel, a gesture that canonized the discoverer as a knight saint of the order, his effigy wearing the habit with the cross of Christ, his hands clasped in eternal prayer for the empire he had founded. The monastery served as the royal pantheon of the Avish dynasty, and its completion in 1601, long after Manuel's death, sealed the identification of the Order of Christ with the very soul of the Portuguese nation, a fusion so complete that the cross of the order became, for all practical purposes, the national emblem, appearing on the sails of warships, the standards of regiments, and the coinage that circulated from Brazil to Japan. While Geronimo's rose on the banks of the Tagus, the convent of Christ in Tomar underwent its own transfiguration, with Manuel ordering the construction of the immense new nave and the chapter house window between 1510 and 1515, works that demanded the quarrying of entire hillsides of the finest limestone from Inca and Portunjos. The nave, designed by Diogo de Arruda, was a hall church of unprecedented scale, its vaults supported by twisted pillars that resembled the ropes of a ship's rigging, the ribs of the ceiling studded with the crosses of the order and the royal arms, the walls lined with chapels endowed by the richest families of the kingdom, each one a microcosm of the maritime enterprise that funded it. The chapter house window, completed around 1515, remains the supreme masterpiece of Manueline sculpture, a riot of maritime motifs so dense that the stone seems to breathe, ropes and cables intertwined with cork branches, artichokes, and seaweed, while the cross of Christ rises above two armillary spheres, the whole composition framed by the figure of an old man of the sea, his beard and hair dissolving into the waves. The window was not merely decorative but profoundly political, a declaration that the Order of Christ had subjugated the ocean itself, transforming the chaotic waters of the Atlantic into a highway of empire, a path of salvation, and a testimony to the unique destiny of Portugal. Every knight who processed through the cloister and paused before this window understood that he belonged to a lineage that stretched back to the Templars and forward to an endless horizon of conquest and conversion, a charge that was both a privilege and a burden, to be carried to the death. The human capital that sustained this imperial machinery was recruited, as it had been since the days of Dom Dinis, from the minor nobility of the Portuguese provinces, families like the Albuquerques, the Almeidas, the Castros, and the Mascarenhas, who had provided the Order of Christ with generations of knights and whose younger sons now competed for the honor of serving in the Indian fleets. Afonso de Albuquerque, the greatest of the Portuguese viceroys of India, was himself a knight of the Order of Christ, and his conquests of Goa in 1510, Malacca in 1511, and Ormuz in 1515 were carried out under the cross of the Order, which he had emblazoned on the sails of his fleet and carved above the gates of every fortress he captured. Albuquerque's strategy was to create a chain of fortified bases that controlled the choke points of the Indian Ocean trade, the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, and the entrance to the Red Sea, a network that would strangle the Muslim spice monopoly and channel the wealth of Asia into the coffers of Lisbon and the treasury of the Order of Christ. His letters to King Manuel are filled with crusading rhetoric, describing the conquests as the work of God under the banner of the cross of Christ, and he requested that the Pope grant a plenary indulgence to all who died in the service of the order in Asia, a request that was granted by Leo X in 1514, further sacralizing the imperial enterprise. When Albuquerque died at sea on December 16, 1515, his body was buried in Goa in a tomb inscribed with the cross of the order, and his soul was commended to the prayers of the brothers of Tomar, who celebrated masses for his soul as they would for any fallen knight. The logistics of the Spice Empire required a permanent fleet that the Order of Christ helped to man and finance, with the king, as Grand Master, appointing the captains of the India armadas from among the Knights of the Order, men who had been trained in navigation, cartography, and the art of naval warfare at the school of the Convent of Christ. The Carrera de India, the India Run, became the longest and most perilous maritime route in human history, a round trip of over 35,000 kilometers that could take 18 months and claim up to a third of the ships and crews through storms, shipwreck, scurvy, and attacks by pirates and rival fleets. The Order of Christ provided not only the captains but also the chaplains who accompanied each fleet, celebrating Mass on the heaving decks, hearing the confessions of the dying, and burying the dead at sea, their black scapulars flapping in the trade winds as they recited the prayers of the office for the dead over the bodies committed to the deep. The religious dimension of the voyages was not a mere formality but the existential framework that made the suffering and the mortality bearable, because the Knights of the Order believed, with a sincerity that modern skepticism struggles to comprehend, that their sacrifices were earning them a place in heaven and that every league sailed, every fortress built, every Moor defeated was a brick in the edifice of the kingdom of God on earth. This fusion of commercial ambition and eschatological conviction was the psychological secret of the Portuguese enterprise, and it was a direct inheritance from the Templars, who had lived and died by the same creed in the Crusader states of Syria and Palestine. The order's financial role in the empire became more systematic under Manuel, with the crown delegating to the order the collection of the quota, the fourth part of all ecclesiastical revenues in the kingdom that had originally been granted for the crusade, as well as the revenues of the Padroado Real. The royal patronage over the overseas churches that the Pope had granted to the Portuguese monarchs as Grand Masters of the order. This meant that every new diocese erected in Brazil, Africa, India, and the East Indies was, in spiritual terms, a fief of the Order of Christ, its bishops appointed by the king acting as Grand Master, its tithes collected by royal officials, and its mission stations staffed by priests who were often themselves members of the order or its affiliated congregations. The system created a self-reinforcing cycle of expansion, because each new colony generated ecclesiastical revenues that were reinvested in further exploration and colonization, a virtuous spiral that accelerated the growth of the empire for a century. By the time of Manuel's death in December 1521, the Order of Christ possessed an annual income that rivaled that of the great monastic orders of Europe, the Cistercians, the Cluniacs, and the Benedictines, and its temporal power extended to every continent touched by the Portuguese caravels. A jurisdiction that no Templar Grand Master could have imagined but that would have filled Gualdem Pius with awe and vindication. The cultural patronage of the order under Manuel I extended to the arts, letters, and sciences, with the Convent of Christ becoming a center for the production of illuminated manuscripts, liturgical music, and the earliest printed books in Portugal, many of them works of geography and navigation dedicated to the Grand Master. The famous Leitura Nova, the great compilation of royal and ecclesiastical legislation, was commissioned by Manuel and illuminated with miniatures depicting the king as a new King David, surrounded by the Knights of the Order in their white mantles, while the armillary sphere and the cross of Christ floated in the gilded margins. The poet Garcia de Resende, who compiled the Cancioneiro Geral, the great anthology of Portuguese court poetry, was a Knight of the Order and dedicated his work to Prince John, the future King John III, praising the cross of Christ as the banner that has conquered the sea and the stars. Even the plays of Gil Vicente, the father of Portuguese theatre, contain references to the order and its mission, with characters invoking the cross of Christ as a talisman against the perils of the deep and the treachery of the Moors. In every domain of cultural production, the order was celebrated as the engine of national greatness, its symbols ubiquitous, its knights the heroes of the age, its history the foundation myth of a kingdom that had risen from a poor corner of Iberia to dominate the trade routes of the planet. This cultural saturation ensured that when the empire began to falter in the later 16th century, the mythology of the order would survive the material decline, a narrative of chosenness that still echoes in Portuguese identity today. The reign of King John III, who succeeded his father Manuel in 1521 and ruled until 1557, marks the transition from the heroic age of discovery to the bureaucratic consolidation of empire, a period in which the Order of Christ became, paradoxically, both more powerful and more dependent on the crown, its spiritual autonomy slowly eroded by the machinery of state. John, nicknamed the Pious, for his intense personal devotion, was the first Portuguese monarch to hold the mastership of all three military orders, Christ, Santiago, and Avis, simultaneously, a concentration of sacred power that made him, in the eyes of his court theologians, the equal of any pope in matters of overseas evangelization. Under his direction, the Order of Christ undertook its most ambitious missionary project yet, the systematic conversion of Brazil, which had been discovered in 1500 but had remained a low-priority outpost compared to the riches of India. John III divided the vast coastline into 12 hereditary captaincies, granting each to a donatary captain who was expected to colonize and develop the territory, and many of these captains were Knights of the Order of Christ who planted the cross on their new lands and named their settlements after the saints of the crusading calendar: São Vicente, Salvador, São Tomé. The first Jesuit missionaries, who arrived in Bahia in 1549 under the leadership of Father Manuel de Nóbrega, a former student of the University of Salamanca who had been deeply influenced by the spirituality of the Order of Christ, carried the cross of the order on their processional banners and saw themselves as the spiritual heirs of the Templars, fighting a spiritual crusade against the darkness of paganism and the depredations of the Protestant Reformation. The alliance between the Order of Christ and the Society of Jesus, which was formally established in 1540 and placed itself under the special protection of the Portuguese crown, created a formidable engine of religious and cultural transformation that would reshape the Americas, Africa, and Asia over the next 2 centuries. The Jesuits, who took a special fourth vow of obedience to the Pope regarding missions, found in the Order of Christ a natural partner, because the Portuguese padroado, the royal patronage over the overseas churches, gave the Grand Master the right to appoint bishops and approve missionary expeditions. And the king was happy to delegate much of the practical work to the energetic and well-educated sons of Ignatius of Loyola. The first bishop of Brazil, Dom Pedro Fernandes Sardinha, who arrived in 1551, was a Knight of the Order of Christ, and his cathedral in Salvador de Bahia was built with funds drawn from the order's treasury, its high altar adorned with the cross of Christ flanked by the arms of King John. The Jesuits, meanwhile, established their first college in Bahia in 1556, dedicated to Our Lady of the Light, and they began the systematic catechesis of the Tupi and Guarani peoples, translating the catechism into the local languages and adapting the rituals of the Church to the rhythms of indigenous life, all under the watchful eye of the order's visitators, who traveled regularly from Tomar to inspect the progress of the mission. The partnership was not without tensions, as the Jesuits sometimes chafed at the royal control exercised through the order, but the mutual benefits were so great that the alliance endured, producing the Baroque synthesis of European and indigenous culture that is still visible in the churches of Ouro Preto, Congonhas, and Salvador. The Indian Ocean Theatre continued to demand the lion's share of the order's resources, and under John III the fortress network reached its greatest extent, with over 50 major strongholds stretching from Sofala in East Africa to Malacca in Southeast Asia, each garrisoned by soldiers and sailors who served under the cross of Christ. The Viceroy Dom João de Castro, one of the most brilliant naval commanders of the age and a devout knight of the order, led the defense of the Portuguese position in India against the combined forces of the Ottoman Empire, the Sultanate of Gujarat, and the Zamorine of Calicut, a titanic struggle that climaxed in the Second Siege of Dio in 1546. A victory so decisive that it secured Portuguese dominance of the Arabian Sea for another century. Castro's letters to the king are filled with references to the cross of Christ as his only shield, and he famously pawned his own beard to raise money for the defense of Goa, a gesture of personal sacrifice that became legendary in Portuguese chronicles and was celebrated in the poetry of Camões. When Castro died in Goa in 1548, worn out by the endless campaigns, his tomb in the Cathedral of Goa was carved with the cross of the order and the words, "For the faith and the empire," a motto that could have served as the epitaph of an entire generation of knights who had given their lives to the dream of a Christian Asia. The Order of Christ commemorated these dead in the Charola of Tomar, where masses were said for their souls in perpetuity, their names inscribed in the necrology of the convent, the roll of honor that grew longer with each passing year. Yet the very success of the enterprise was beginning to strain the human and financial resources of a kingdom of only 1.5 million souls, and the reign of John III saw the first signs of the structural weaknesses that would eventually bring the empire low. The demographic drain of shipping thousands of young men to the tropics every year, many of them never to return, left whole regions of Portugal depopulated, while the influx of cheap Asian goods undermined domestic industry and created a dependency on foreign trade that made the kingdom vulnerable to fluctuations in the spice market. The Order of Christ, which had once been the engine of expansion, was increasingly reduced to the role of a passive rentier, collecting its tithes and spending them on the maintenance of the convent and the celebration of liturgies, rather than investing in new voyages and new technologies. The religious climate was also changing, as the Protestant Reformation tore Europe apart and the Catholic Church responded with the Council of Trent, which sought to reform the monasteries and eliminate the abuses that had crept into the religious orders over the centuries. The Order of Christ, with its unique hybrid character, half military and half monastic, was viewed with suspicion by the Tridentan reformers, who preferred the clean lines of the new Jesuit and Capuchin missions to the archaic chivalric mystique of the cross and the sword. In 1551, the Pope issued the bull Praeclara Carissimi, which reaffirmed the privileges of the order but also required a stricter observance of the Cistercian rule, a gentle but insistent pressure that would, over the following decades, push the order towards a more purely religious identity and away from its military roots. The accession of the young King Sebastian in 1557, at the age of 3, plunged the kingdom into a regency that lasted until 1568, and marked the beginning of a period of political instability that would culminate in the disaster of Alcácer. Sebastian was raised by his grandmother, Catherine of Austria, and his uncle, Cardinal Henry, in an atmosphere of intense crusading fervor, steeped in the legends of the Templars and the Order of Christ, and he grew to adulthood convinced that he was destined to lead a new crusade against the Moors of North Africa and recover the lost crown of Jerusalem. The Order of Christ, which had been founded to fight the infidel, became the natural vehicle for the king's ambitions, and he lavished funds on the order's armory, commissioned new ships to be built under the cross of Christ, and appointed his closest friends to the commanderies, transforming the order into a personal instrument of his crusading dream. The chronicler Friar Bernardo da Costa wrote that Sebastian walked and slept with the cross of Christ on his breast, and dreamed every night of the battle that would undo the shame of Alcácer, a description that captures the king's tragic monomania. In 1578, Sebastian assembled an army of 17,000 men, including many knights of the Order of Christ, and sailed for Morocco, ignoring the advice of his counselors and the warnings of the weather, convinced that the cross would grant him a miraculous victory over the vastly larger forces of the Sultan Abd al-Malik. The Battle of Alcácer, fought on August 4, 1578 near the Lucos River in northern Morocco, was a catastrophe of biblical proportions, the worst military defeat in Portuguese history, a single day that shattered the flower of the nobility, killed the young king, and set in motion a succession crisis that would lead to the absorption of Portugal into the Spanish monarchy. The Knights of the Order of Christ charged into the Moroccan lines with the cross on their surcoats, and the old crusading cry on their lips. But they were cut down by the thousands, their bodies left to rot on the African plain, their armor stripped by the camp followers of the Sultan, their banners captured and sent to Istanbul as trophies of the victory of Islam over Christendom. Sebastian's body was never positively identified, and the legend that he would return, the Sebastianism that became a messianic cult in Portugal, was born from the trauma of that day. A collective refusal to accept that the god who had guided the caravels had abandoned the kingdom on a Moroccan battlefield. The Order of Christ was decapitated along with the king, because Sebastian had been the Grand Master, and the order's treasury, already depleted by the cost of the expedition, was now empty, its knights dead or captive, its castles mortgaged, its prestige shattered. The treasure divided had come full circle. The institution that Dom Dinis had saved from the flames was now itself a burnt offering on the altar of a king's obsession, a sacrifice that would change the course of Portuguese history forever. The death of King Sebastian at Alcácer without a direct heir triggered a dynastic crisis that would culminate in the 60-year captivity of Portugal under the Spanish Habsburgs, a period in which the Order of Christ, like the kingdom itself, lost much of its independence and saw its ancient privileges eroded by the centralizing bureaucracy of Madrid. The Cardinal Henry, Sebastian's great-uncle, was the last surviving legitimate male of the House of Avish, and he assumed the throne as a reluctant interim ruler, but his advanced age and clerical status made it impossible for him to produce an heir, and his death in January 1580 opened the door to the claims of Philip II of Spain, the grandson of King Manuel through his mother Isabella. Philip marched an army of 37,000 men into Portugal under the command of the Duke of Alba, and after the brief and bloody Battle of Alcántara in August 1580, the kingdom submitted to Spanish rule, with Philip promising in the Cortes of Tomar in April 1581 to preserve Portugal's laws, its coinage, its language, and the autonomy of its military orders. A promise that was honored in the breach from the very beginning. The Order of Christ, whose grand mastership was now held by the Spanish Habsburgs, became a tool of imperial patronage, with Philip II and his successors Philip III and Philip IV distributing the commanderies and their rich incomes to Spanish favorites, Dutch loyalists, and Italian cardinals, diluting the Portuguese character of the order and alienating the native nobility that had been its backbone since the days of Dom Dinis. The loss of the order's autonomy was felt most acutely in the convent of Christ in Tomar, which had been the heart and soul of the institution, and which now languished under absentee masters who rarely visited, leaving the administration to a succession of corrupt stewards who siphoned off the rents and allowed the buildings to fall into disrepair. The great library of the Infante, the repository of the navigational secrets that had built the empire, was neglected, its manuscripts left to the ravages of humidity and insects, its shelves plundered by bibliophiles and spies who sold the Port Hollande charts to the Dutch and English enemies of Spain. The Spanish kings, embroiled in the endless wars of the Counter-Reformation, the Dutch Revolt, and the struggle with Elizabethan England, saw Portugal primarily as a source of ships, sailors, and money, not as a spiritual partner in the crusade, and the Order of Christ was bled white by the demands of the Armada and the Atlantic convoys. Between 1580 and 1640, the Portuguese possessions in Asia were systematically attacked and captured by the Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company, and the Order's fortresses in Malacca, Ceylon, the Moluccas, and the Malabar coast fell one by one, their garrisons starved into surrender, their crosses hauled down and replaced by the tricolour of the United Provinces. The dream of a Christian empire in the East, which the Order of Christ had nourished for a century and a half, was dying under the Spanish yoke, and the knights who remained loyal to the order could only. The 17th-century transformation of the Order of Christ from a military frontier institution into a predominantly honorific order of courtly chivalry was accelerated by the nature of the post-Restoration state, which needed to reward loyalty and service without the burden of maintaining a standing army of warrior monks. King John IV and his successors, Afonso VI and Pedro II, granted the habit of the order to an ever-widening circle of nobles, courtiers, and even wealthy merchants who had loaned money to the crown, diluting the exclusivity and the martial spirit that had defined the order since its foundation. The original requirement of noble birth, the provas de nobreza, was relaxed in practice, and the knights increasingly saw their membership not as a sacred calling but as a decoration, a badge of social status that entitled the wearer to certain fiscal immunities and a pension from the order's diminished rents. The Convent of Christ, which had once housed a permanent community of warrior monks preparing for the African voyages, became a sinecure, its cloisters echoing with the footsteps of absentee commendators who never set foot in Tomar, their obligations discharged by paid substitutes who kept the liturgy going with the minimum required for canonical compliance. The great rotunda of the Charola, where Gualdan Pius and his knights had knelt before the altar to pledge their lives to the defense of the Holy Sepulchre, was now a tourist attraction for the grand tourists of the Enlightenment, who came to sketch the Gothic oddity, and to marvel at the superstitious fervor that had once launched 1,000 ships. And yet, even in its decline, the Order of Christ retained a symbolic power that transcended its diminished material circumstances, because the cross of the order had become permanently fused with the identity of the Portuguese nation, a talisman of past greatness that could be invoked in moments of crisis to rally the people to the defense of the faith and the fatherland. When the Dutch attempted to conquer Brazil in the 1640s, the Portuguese colonists who fought under the leadership of João Fernandes Vieira and the black commander Henrique Dias raised the cross of Christ on their standards and sang the old crusading hymns as they marched into the Battle of Guararapes in 1648, a victory that sealed the expulsion of the Dutch and was attributed, in the sermons of the Jesuit Father Antonio Vieira, to the miraculous intercession of the cross. Vieira, the greatest preacher of the Portuguese Baroque, developed a theology, but the Convent of Christ, like the order whose headquarters it had been, had one last transformation to undergo, a resurrection that would begin in the middle of the 19th century with the rise of the Romantic movement and the cult of national monuments. And that would culminate in the 20th century with its recognition as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and its restoration as one of the most visited tourist destinations in Portugal. The first step was the visit of King Ferdinand II, the Prince Consort of Queen Maria II, who in 1843 toured the ruins of Tomar and was so moved by the beauty of the Charola and the Janela do Capitulo that he ordered the first systematic cleaning and stabilization of the buildings, a project that consumed the royal purse and established the precedent for state-funded heritage conservation in Portugal. Ferdinand, a German prince of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was a romantic medievalist who saw in the convent the perfect embodiment of the chivalric ideals that he admired in the novels of Sir Walter Scott and the paintings of the Nazarene school, and his patronage attracted artists, architects, and archaeologists from across Europe, who came to Tomar to measure, sketch, and dream. The Convent of Christ became, in the hands of the Romantics, a national shrine, a place where the Portuguese could go to reconnect with the golden age of the discoveries and to mourn, in a safe and aestheticized form, the loss of the empire that had once made them great. The abolition of the religious orders by the liberal government of 1834, which extinguished all monasteries, convents, and religious corporations in Portugal, could have been the final death blow to the memory of the Order of Christ, but paradoxically, it was the beginning of a new life for the Old Cross, as it was adopted by the secular state as the supreme national decoration and the emblem of the Republic that would emerge in 1910. The Liberal Revolution, inspired by the French and Spanish models, saw the military orders as symbols of the ancien regime, the tools of royal absolutism and ecclesiastical privilege, but the new constitutional monarchy needed a system of honors that could reward civic virtue without the taint of aristocratic birth. The Order of Christ, with its prestige undiminished and its cross recognized by every Portuguese from the peasant of Trás-os-Montes to the merchant of Porto, was the perfect candidate, and in 1834 it was formally reconstituted as an order of merit, open to all citizens regardless of class or religion. A revolutionary democratization of a symbol that had once been reserved for the nobility of blood and the purity of faith. The first recipients under the new dispensation included scientists like the botanist Felix de Avilar Brotero, military heroes like the Duke of Terceira, and even foreign heads of state like Queen Victoria of England, who received the Grand Cross in 1836. A gesture that integrated the order into the international system of diplomatic honors and freed it from the narrow confines of Portuguese domestic politics. The 19th century transformation of the Order of Christ from a religious confraternity into a state decoration was accompanied by a massive effort of historical scholarship, as the liberal historians of the New Portugal sought to reconstruct the authentic story of the Templars and the Order of Christ. Stripping away the legends of esoteric treasure and secret rites that had accumulated over the centuries and replacing them with a narrative based on archival documents and critical method. The great historian Alexander Herculano, a liberal exile who spent much of his life studying the medieval charters in the Torre do Tombo, published his monumental History of the Origin and Establishment of the Inquisition in Portugal in 1854, a work that incidentally shed light on the Templar dissolution and the foundation of the Order of Christ, exposing Philip the Fair's cynicism and Dom Dinis's diplomatic skill in a way that had never been done before. Herculano was a rationalist and a skeptic, But he could not suppress a grudging admiration for the poet-king who had outwitted the papacy and the French monarchy to preserve the Templar legacy. And his work laid the foundation for the modern historiography that would eventually rescue the true story of the order from the swamp of myth and conspiracy theory. The publication of the Monumenta Henricina, the great collection of documents related to Prince Henry and the Order of Christ, between 1960 and 1974, completed this scholarly enterprise, providing the archival basis for the narrative that we have been presenting in this video, a narrative that is grounded in the dry facts of bulls, letters, and account books, but that is no less astonishing for all its documentary austerity. The Portuguese Republic, proclaimed on October 5, 1910, continued the trajectory set by the constitutional monarchy, but with an added layer of anti-clericalism that could easily have led to the abolition of the Order of Christ along with the other relics of the monarchical past. The Republican leaders, however, understood the power of national symbols and chose to retain the order as the second most important decoration of the state, after the sash of the three orders, renaming it the Military Order of Christ, and assigning it to the President of the Republic as its Grand Master, a secular reincarnation of the royal mastership that Dom Dinis had created and Manuel the Fortunate had made hereditary. The Cross of Christ, stripped of its religious associations in the official discourse, became a purely civic emblem, awarded to ministers, ambassadors, generals, and even the poet Fernando Pessoa, who received the order in 1930 for his services to Portuguese literature, an ironic destiny for a symbol that had been forged in the crusading fires of the Reconquista. The Convent of Christ, meanwhile, continued its slow restoration under the direction of the Dirección General dos Edificios y Monumentos Nacionales, the state agency responsible for the conservation of national monuments, which undertook the cleaning of the chapter house window, the repair of the cloister vaults, and the reinstallation of the magnificent polychrome altarpiece of the charola. A work that took decades and consumed a significant portion of the cultural budget of the Estado Novo, the authoritarian regime of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar that ruled Portugal from 1932 to 1968. Salazar, a former seminary professor of economics who became the dictator of Portugal for 36 years, understood the propaganda value of the Order of Christ and the convent of Tomar better than any ruler since Manuel the Fortunate, and he systematically exploited the Templar legacy to legitimize his regime and to bolster the myth of Portugal's imperial destiny. The Estado Novo adopted the Cross of Christ as one of its unofficial emblems, placing it on public buildings, official documents, and the uniforms of the youth movement, the Mocidade Portuguesa, a deliberate echo of the crusading knights who had built the empire. Salazar's speech at the Convent of Christ in 1940, during the centennial exhibition of the Portuguese world, was a masterpiece of nationalist rhetoric, in which he praised the spiritual continuity that linked the Templars, the Order of Christ, and the modern Portuguese state, a continuity that he claimed was the secret of the nation's survival through the centuries of hardship and decline. The exhibition, held in Belém, included a pavilion dedicated to the Order of Christ, displaying replicas of the caravels, models of the fortresses of the East, and a giant illuminated cross that dominated the night sky, a spectacle that attracted millions of visitors and cemented the association of the order with the regime's ideology of national resurgence. The African colonies, which Portugal refused to decolonize until 1975, were presented as the living continuation of the order's mission, a civilizing crusade that justified the sacrifice of blood and treasure in the jungles of Angola and Mozambique. A rhetorical move that was transparently propagandistic but that resonated with a population still steeped in the mythology of the discoveries. The collapse of the Estado Novo in the Carnation Revolution of April 25, 1974, and the subsequent decolonization of the African territories brought an abrupt end to the imperial narrative that had sustained the public image of the Order of Christ for centuries, and the cross, like the nation itself, had to find a new meaning in the democratic and post-colonial era. The revolutionaries, many of whom were leftist officers and Marxist intellectuals, initially wanted to abolish all the old orders of chivalry as relics of fascism and monarchy, but cooler heads prevailed, and the Order of Christ was retained as a decoration that could be awarded to anyone, Portuguese or foreign, who had served the cause of culture, science, or human rights. A reform that reflected the new values of the democratic republic. The Convent of Christ, which had been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1983, was embraced as a symbol not of empire but of cultural synthesis, a monument to the meeting of civilizations that had produced the unique Luso tropical culture celebrated by the Brazilian sociologist Gilberto Freire and the poet Jorge Amado. The cross of the order, which had once been a sign of conquest, was now reinterpreted as a sign of dialogue, a bridge between the continents that the Portuguese caravels had first linked, a message of peace that replaced the sword of the crusader with the compass of the navigator. The modern historiography of the Templars and the Order of Christ, which has flourished in the decades since the Carnation Revolution, has been characterized by a rigorous critical method that has separated the verifiable facts from the accumulated legends, but also by a growing appreciation of the unique role that Portugal played in the transmission of the Templar legacy to the modern world. Scholars like Bernardo de Vasconcelos e Souza, Maria Cristina Pimenta, and Luis Tadeo de Fonseca have combed through the archives of the Vatican, the Torre do Tombo, and the Order of Christ itself, publishing critical editions of the founding bulls, the inventories of the commanderies, and the correspondence of the Grand Masters. A monumental labor of erudition that has left no aspect of the Order's history unexamined. Their work has definitively established that the Order of Christ was not a secret society, a depository of heretical knowledge, or the guardian of a hidden physical treasure, but a perfectly documented institution whose every property, every privilege, and every appointment was recorded in the bureaucratic prose of the medieval and early modern state, a reality that is, in its own way, more impressive than any myth. The inventories of the Order's lands, for example, show that by 1500 it controlled over 200,000 hectares of agricultural land, 17 castles, 22 towns, and hundreds of mills, vineyards, and salt pans, an economic empire that was transparent to the tax collectors of the crown and that generated the revenues that funded the voyages of Vasco da Gama and Pedro Alvarez Cabral. A chain of causation that can be traced from the ledgers of the commanderies to the cargo manifests of the caravels. The archaeological investigation of the Convent of Christ and the other Templar castles in Portugal has added a material dimension to the documentary record, with excavations revealing the original Roman foundations of the Tomar Hill, the Templar masonry of the 12th century, and the Manuline additions of the early 16th century, a stratigraphy of stone that tells the same story as the manuscripts. The restoration of the Charola, which was undertaken between 1987 and 2013 with funding from the European Union and the Portuguese state, uncovered the original polychrome decoration of the rotunda, a cycle of frescoes depicting the saints of the crusading tradition, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, Saint George, and Saint James the Moor Slayer, as well as the symbols of the temple and the Order of Christ, a discovery that thrilled art historians and confirmed the continuity of iconography between the two orders. The frescoes, which had been covered by layers of later paint and the grime of centuries, were painstakingly cleaned with scalpels and solvents by a team of international conservators, revealing colors of startling brilliance, the lapis lazuli blues, the vermilion reds, and the gold leaf that had once dazzled the eyes of the knights who prayed beneath them. The restored Charola, which reopened to the public in 2013, is now one of the most visited monuments in Portugal, receiving over 500,000 visitors a year, a number that testifies to the enduring fascination of the Templar story and the profound historical resonance of the space where it all began. The cultural impact of the Templar legend in the modern world, fed by the novels of Dan Brown, the films of Ridley Scott, and the video games of the Assassin's Creed franchise, has generated a massive popular interest in the Order of Christ and the Convent of Tomar, an interest that the Portuguese tourism authorities have been eager to cultivate with Templar-themed tours, medieval fairs, and commemorative merchandise. The Rota dos Templarios, the Templar Route, a tourist itinerary that connects the castles of Tomar, Almoral, Pombal, and Monsanto, draws hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, many of them from the United States, Brazil, and Northern Europe, who come seeking the mystery and the romance that the books and movies have promised. The local guides, trained by historians and archaeologists, have learned to balance the demand for legend with the obligation to truth, telling the story of the Portuguese Templars in a way that acknowledges the popular myths while gently steering the visitors toward the documented reality, a reality that is, in its own way, as gripping as any fiction. The treasure that the visitors seek is not the gold of Solomon's temple or the Holy Grail, but the treasure of an authentic historical experience, the chance to stand in the same round church where Guald and Pius prayed, to touch the same stones that Dom Dinis saved from the destruction, and to imagine the moment when Vasco da Gama knelt before the altar to receive the blessing that would send him to India. A treasure that cannot be stolen or divided, because it belongs to the collective memory of humanity. The Order of Christ today exists in a dual form, as a state decoration that continues to be awarded by the President of the Portuguese Republic and as a historical legacy that is studied, preserved, and celebrated by scholars, institutions, and the general public. The award of the Order of Christ in 2020 to the Portuguese medical workers who fought on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic was a poignant reminder that the cross is still a living symbol of service and sacrifice. Not a relic of a dead past, but a thread that connects the anonymous knights who died on the African sands to the nurses and doctors who risked their lives in the wards of the hospitals of Lisbon and Porto. The President of the Republic, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, a former professor of constitutional law and a passionate advocate of historical memory, used the occasion to evoke the long line of servants of the cross, who had, from the Middle Ages to the present, placed the common good above their own safety, a lineage that he traced explicitly to the founders of the Order of Christ and the Templars before them. The gesture, which was widely reported in the Portuguese media, demonstrated that the old symbol still has the power to move and to unite, that the divided treasure of the temple, which had been scattered across Europe in the 14th century and gathered again in Tomar, has not yet exhausted its capacity to inspire. The enduring mystery that fuels the Templar legend, the question of what happened to the treasure, can now be answered with a certainty that is at once historical and philosophical, because the treasure, as we have seen again and again, was never a hoard of gold but the knowledge, the organization, and the spiritual vision that were transmitted from the temple to the Order of Christ and from the Order of Christ to the modern world. The true wealth was the institutional continuity that allowed a small kingdom on the edge of Europe to launch the first global empire, the legal genius that preserved the Templar assets intact, the maritime technology that unlocked the ocean routes, and the missionary zeal that carried the cross to the distant shores of Brazil and Japan. The Portuguese case proves that the greatest treasures are not the ones that are hidden but the ones that are shared, not the ones that are consumed but the ones that are invested, and that the legacy of a noble ideal can survive the rise and fall of empires, the dissolution of institutions, and the passage of centuries, as long as there are those who remember and those who believe. The Convent of Christ, standing on its hill over the Nabeiro River, is the monument to this truth, and the cross of the Order, which still flies on the flags, medals, and hearts of millions, is its eternal sign, a sign that has traveled farther than any physical treasure and has enriched the world in ways that no chest of gold ever could. The international dimension of the Templar mystery, the persistent belief that the Order of the Temple survived in secret and transmitted its knowledge to future generations, has been fueled for centuries by the existence of the Order of Christ, which is, in the eyes of the conspiracy theorists, the visible tip of a hidden iceberg of Templar continuity. The fact that the Portuguese Templars were never found guilty of heresy, that their assets were transferred intact to a new order with a new name, and that this order went on to achieve spectacular successes in navigation and empire, has been interpreted by the mythmakers as evidence of a deeper plot. A secret plan to dominate the world that was hatched in the dungeons of the temple and executed over the course of 500 years. The novels, the documentaries, and the websites that propagate this theory point to the cross of Christ on the sails of the caravels, the armillary sphere of King Manuel, and the occult symbolism of the Janela do Capitulo as proof that the Portuguese discoveries were not a spontaneous outburst of maritime energy but a carefully orchestrated operation guided by a hidden elite of Templar initiates. The historians, of course, have demolished these claims with the patient accumulation of documentary evidence, showing that the Order of Christ was a thoroughly conventional medieval institution, that its members were Orthodox Catholics who left voluminous records of their prayers, their accounts, and their property transactions. and that the symbols that the conspiracy theorists find so suggestive were simply the visual language of the Christian crusading tradition, a language that had been used by thousands of knights, churches, and brotherhoods across Europe for centuries. Yet the persistence of the myth is itself a historical phenomenon that deserves to be understood, because it tells us something important about the human need for mystery and meaning in a disenchanted world, and about the enduring power of the Templar name to evoke the lost romance of the Crusades, the Holy Grail, and the secret wisdom of the ancients. The myth of the Templar treasure, as it has evolved in the popular culture of the West, is a modern creation that has little to do with the historical Templars and everything to do with the anxieties and aspirations of the societies that have produced it, from the anti-clerical Freemasons of the Enlightenment who saw the Templars as precursors of rationalism and liberty, to the occultists of the 19th century who wove them into the fabric of theosophy and Hermeticism, to the New Age seekers of the 20th century who turned them into guardians of the planetary consciousness. The Portuguese case, with its sober documentation and its transparent continuity, has often been ignored by the mythmakers because it is too factual, too boring, too lacking in the esoteric frisson that the market demands, and yet it is precisely this sobriety that makes it the most powerful refutation of the myth and the most compelling vindication of the real Templar legacy. The truth, it turns out, is stranger and more wonderful than the fiction, because the fiction is limited only by the imagination of the novelist, while the truth is constrained by the infinite complexity of actual history, a complexity that includes the genius of Dom Dinis, the ambition of Prince Henry, and the courage of Vasco da Gama, none of whom needed a secret society to achieve their goals, because they had an institution, a mission, and a cross. The future of the Order of Christ, as a historical subject and a living symbol, lies in the balance between scholarship and popular interest, between the cold analysis of the archives and the warm appeal of the legends that continue to draw millions to the convent of Tomar and the other Templar sites of Portugal. The Portuguese state, through its ministries of culture and tourism, has invested heavily in the restoration of the Templar heritage, not merely as a source of revenue but as a statement of national identity, a reminder to the Portuguese and to the world that this small country was once the center of the planet, the hinge on which the globe turned from the medieval to the modern. The Convent of Christ is now a center for historical research, a venue for conferences on military orders and medieval studies, and a pilgrimage site for the curious, the devout, and the skeptical, all of whom come to touch the walls and to ask the question that has echoed through the centuries: what is the treasure that the Templars left behind? The answer, which the stones of Tomar whisper to those who have ears to hear, is that the treasure is not a thing but a story of survival, adaptation, and transformation, a story that began in the Temple of Solomon and continues in the caravels of the discoveries, the cathedrals of Brazil, and the crosses that still shine on the medals of the doctors and nurses who serve the sick. A story that belongs to all of us and that can never be divided, spent, or forgotten. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.